So hello everyone and welcome to this rather strange and different video from the others. It is actually quite strange for me to introduce myself this way and to do it with my actual real voice. Because yes, the doubt that many of you had was true. All this time I was using AI, however, it was still my real cloned voice. That's it. That's it. Like, it was really just my real voice, but cloned. I was not using another popular voice or whatever. I wanted to clarify that before starting this special FIQ video for our 1000 plus subscribers, because I didn't want this to become some sort of secret inadvertently, and for everyone to think that I was trying to hide it, when I wasn't actually. Only that I find it much easier and more practical than using my real voice, for several reasons that I will mention right now. To begin with, as you can imagine, now more than ever listening to my true voice, I am not a native English speaker, which already puts me at an extreme disadvantage when it comes to recording a script in a fluid and pleasant way for you guys. But believe it or not, that's not the main factor. Not even close. After all, I am still the one who writes the scripts for these videos that you all love so much, and thank you for that, by the way. And so it shows my high level of fluency and understanding, at least, of your language by being able to write in it without any problems, basically. Now, the problem is that for some reason that still eludes me, no matter what language I'm speaking, even with my first native language, I have a lot of trouble pronouncing it correctly. Like right now, I have a lot of trouble concentrating, articulating, and not stumbling when I speak. No matter how hard I try, I always stutter when I speak, many times in a few seconds, like right now again. For example, the video for What If Augustus Was Immortal, my very first video, in fact, I originally planned to do it with my real voice, so I recorded myself reading the script for that 22-minute video, and it took me almost 8 hours to record the whole script, and even then, my pronunciation was awful. It just wasn't presentable for a video, especially when it's, like the first impression I'm going to give to all of you guys. Added to the brutal amount of audio editing I had to cut out all of the moments I've stuttered, like right now, which after 8 hours of recording, you can imagine is a lot of stutter moments, and I've just finally accepted that it would be much more practical to clone my voice to make the videos. Simple as that. And that 8-hour audio was the one I ultimately used to clone my voice with the help of AI, the voice you've been hearing in my videos all this time. And again, I repeat, this happens to me in every language I speak, not just English, and even in my native language. And in that case, it's even worse because having a perfectly native accent in my language, I sound even more like an idiot when I stutter. I don't know, maybe after 25 years of being so far removed from the rest of humanity, my facial muscles are permanently atrophied from speaking properly. Because I'm sure it's not a problem of confidence or linguistic knowledge, as you can hear from the scripts I write for you. And yeah, I'm pretty confident. I have a good esteem, a decent, reasonable esteem of myself, and I'm not afraid to speak to people, so I don't know why. It's just like, some people stutter when they speak, and that's it. You can't change that. It's an error in a malfunction in their brain. I don't know. In any case, I promise you that AI was never my first choice, but it was the best option given my verbal limitations, to say it in some way. In my case, I can truly say without exaggeration that I am what you might call a real voice cell, Anyway, enough with the yapping. I know you don't like it. Another flaw I have in my way of expressing myself, unfortunately. I just like to over-explain myself for any stupid thing, whatever it is, how insignificant it is. I have to explain myself for 5 to 10 minutes for anything random. So I apologize for that, and I'm trying to get better to that. And again, it's not because English is not my native language. Like, I do that also in my native language that I think I will not reveal yet. Yeah, I'm not confident, but it's not that obvious, and that's why I like it. I don't have the typical stereotypical accent that you can imagine when someone from my country, birth country, because I live there, speak English, so it's quite funny. But anyway, let's get over all of this, and let's start with that. Now, you heard my voice. Yes, this is my true voice, and I hope that now you understand why it is better for all of us that I keep using AI on my videos, right? Because this is clearly not working. It won't work, I promise. So it's better just to get used to it and to forget about the idea of using my real voice, at least for now. Now then, let's return to the AI voice for the rest of the video, please. And goodbye to real me. So, now, back to the topic of celebrating the over 1,025 subscribers. I'm going to start answering the questions some of you left me, and I'm very grateful for your participation. So, the first 5 questions comes from the user Sum Romanus Greco-Hispanicus, who's asking me the next few things. First of all, what do I think of Vulgar Latin and Everyday Latin? I'm assuming by Everyday Latin you're referring to Classical Latin. Okay, well, in my opinion, saying that it's my opinion is somewhat absurd because it's mostly a fact, but out of humility I will say that it's just my opinion. The separation between Classical Latin and what we call Vulgar Latin is stupid and has no validity or reason to exist. The myth that in ancient Rome there was some kind of a clear linguistic separation between the elites and the plebs is simply absurd and has no historical validity. Other users like Metatron or Polymathy have already explained it much better than I could ever do, and I recommend you watch their videos to understand it better. But trying to summarize and simplify it in the easiest way possible, imagine that today there would be several ways to describe English and its variants. For example, there would be a classical English from England, as that language originated there, while American English, Canadian English, Australian English, or New Zealand English could be considered or called Vulgar English. Sounds stupid, right? Well, that's because it is. And in the same way, that separation between the elites and the poor makes no sense. Today, people from wealthy families or even politicians speak very differently than the average person on the street. This is due to their education and choice of words to sound as distinguished and elegant as possible while speaking, not because those two worlds literally speak a different language. It would be stupid to categorize a rich English and a vulgar English for being poor, wouldn't it? Well, that was the same for Latin, not because in other parts of the empire people had a different accent than the Latin spoken by the Italians, or even the citizens of the city of Rome, meant that their Latin was another language impossible to understand for the Latins of Rome. It was simply a slight regional difference in expressions, slangs, and accents, exactly the same as today. It's for that reason, for example, that the Spanish spoken in Madrid is not called Classical Spanish, and the Spanish spoken in the south of Spain in Andalusia is called Vulgar Spanish. Because it's just stupid, both languages are the same. So, forget about that stupid theory of Classical Latin and Vulgar Latin, because simply put, Vulgar Latin does not exist and never existed. The second question would be, what topics will the next videos on the channel cover? And well, there will be many and varied ones. Some alternate stories will be more classic and less original than others, but in general, and the good thing about my perfectionism is that I've already prepared a list of all the alternate stories I want to create for 2025. I'm not going to reveal the entire list literally because it would be very long, and I don't want to spoil the surprise for everyone listing all the alternate scenarios I have prepared. But for example, to cite some of the most original ideas I had, what if the French comic book characters known as Asterix and Obelix and their entire village with magic potion existed during Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars? What if the Roman Empire, as their entire land and population, was teleported to the present, replacing the modern European and Northern African nations? What if the Mycenaean Greeks survived the Bronze Age collapse? Or one more for the ride, what if Justinian could see the future? A crazy and funny alternate scenario, just like the one with Augustus being immortal that I'm planning to do eventually. And of course, I'm always open to reading your recommendations for alternate histories if you have any, as long as it has something to do with Greco-Roman culture, which is the era and civilization I specialize in. The third question is, what do I think of the Spanish Empire being the last heir of Rome? Absolute nonsense. Not because I despise the Spanish Empire or because I think there is another more legitimate candidate, but because more than anything, I don't care. And because I completely disagree with the desperate and ridiculous idea of constantly trying to find a legitimate successor for Rome. The truth is that none, absolutely no empire compares to the Roman Empire, and none is worthy of its legacy, its prestige and greatness, and none lasted as long as the Roman Empire anyway. But I will admit that it is funny, and a testament to how unique Rome is and will forever be, how the empires and nations that came after its fall still desperately try to claim themselves as heirs of Rome in order to establish their legitimacy, even when those people, and cultures, have nothing to do with the Romans, as was the case with the Russian Empire and their idea of calling themselves the Third Rome. What can I say, guys? Rome just is the best thing that ever happened to humanity's legacy. That's why I'm loyal to Rome, not this pathetic excuse for a civilization. The fourth question is, what is my honest opinion on the current state of the West? Well, my honest opinion is that we've had a fun ride, but we're now approaching the end of this civilizational era that began with the Renaissance and reached its peak with the Industrial Revolution. For the first attempt at reviving Rome, I'd say it's been good, we've learned a lot, now we just have to wait for the next collapse that we're all going to experience in our lifetime, and use all our knowledge and understanding of classical culture that we couldn't have in earlier times to rebuild the world and finally answer the questions we've been holding in our heads of mentally sick civilization for the last 1500 years. And those questions all have the same answer, and the answer is Rome. The blackout we had in Spain, the country where I live, at the beginning of May, opened my eyes and made me realize that the total collapse of our modern civilization is much closer than I initially thought. If you had asked me how long we had before we will collapse 6 months ago, I would have confidently replied that we still have a margin of between 50 to 150 years before we return to the Dark Ages. But now, after the experience of the blackout in Spain, the margin is much smaller, and I am now completely convinced that the collapse that will return us to a technological level prior to the Industrial Revolution could occur within 6 months or within 20 years, but no more than that. And honestly, I'm not afraid. On the contrary, if it has to happen, I'm excited about it. We'll finally have a chance to clean it all up and start over, like we haven't been able to do in the last 300 years. And who knows? Perhaps the West will finally see the light at the end of the tunnel, as it hasn't seen it since the day Constantine became emperor more than 1700 years ago, and that Rome will finally come back. Only time will tell. And the fifth question is, what do I think of Constantine XI, the last Roman emperor in history? Well, I think he was a great man, a brave and proud warrior and leader who did everything he could with what little he had. Maybe he wasn't perfect, maybe he made some bad decisions, but it's easy to criticize when those events have already happened. But I will never question the bravery and honor that this man had, preferring to stay and die with his men until the last moment before Constantinople fell, when he could have easily escaped from Constantinople and left the Romans to their fate with the Turks. But no, he preferred to die with honor than to live in shame, just like a true Roman would have done. Honestly, it's an epic and tragic ending, and it always brings tears to my eyes when I think about it. Only Greco-Roman civilization is so dramatic and poetic that it can have endings worthy of Hollywood movies in real life. But as I said, Rome may be gone for now, but the good thing about ideas, unlike people, is that ideas never dies as long as someone remembers them. So have faith. Have faith, Roman brothers. One day, someday, perhaps the light of Rome will shine once again in the West, and perhaps the collapse we are all about to experience will be a golden opportunity to do it so. The next two questions comes from the user Hellman Brooks, asking me, first of all, how am I? Well, to answer your first question, I'm fine, Hellman. Very fine, actually. That's because of the many recent changes I've had in my perspective, or more acceptance, of what type of audience I had to direct my content and work to, but also because of what happened in Southern Europe and especially in Spain at the beginning of May. While everyone was panicking and in a state of alert and terror higher than we had during the pandemic, I was living and understanding life like never before. I won't say happy, but euphoric. Yes, I was euphoric, enthusiastic, defiant, ready. I was simply ready for it, even if it was unexpected. That moment made me understand that, at least in my case, everything was going to be okay. I was ready. It gave me a sense of calm and stoicism I didn't think I had on the edge of the collapse of our civilization. So, yes, I'm not saying I'm doing perfect, or even that I'm happy, but I'm optimistic about my own future. Now that I know I won't have to worry my whole life about whether I'll make it through the end of the month, and how I'll pay my rent, other bills, taxes, and more, it's super relieving to understand all of that. Well, yes, I'm optimistic, I'm excited, I'm defiant, and I'm really looking forward to it. The second question of Hellman is, what do I think of the advancements in AI so far? And as you can imagine from my constant use of AI in my content, my opinion on AI and its current evolution is quite positive. I want to pause to express my shock and surprise at how closed-minded the Anglo-Saxons are about this innovation. I truly do not understand the hostility and violence some people feel toward the development of AI. For decades, Anglo-Saxons have been at the forefront of innovation and adoption of new technological advances compared to the rest of the world. It is mostly for this reason that since the Second World War, we in Europe have been seen, and rightly so, as people closed-minded to innovation and new developments, being very pedantic, arrogant, dismissive of anything new, and always taking 10 to 20 years longer than the Anglo-Saxon world to adopt these innovations out of some kind of contemptuous ego, I guess. Who knows? With the French being the archetype of the most known European closed-mindedness people worldwide, and again, rightly so. But suddenly with AI, it seems that the Anglo-Saxons have gone completely crazy like the Europeans by being so closed-minded, hostile, aggressive, and even violent about the advances of AI and the people who use it. I understand that AI could mean the eventual replacement of many jobs where humans are involved. But you have to understand that this is what technological progress is, the world of automation we live in. This has been the case since we began the Industrial Revolution almost 3 centuries ago. Because, okay, if you want to be against all the automated innovations we humans have had, and that have taken away several job sectors that previously only had our hands to exist, I respect and understand that position. But in that case, don't be hypocrites and go deeper into your ideology. If what bothers you is that there are machines and non-living inventions that do the job better than humans, or even just living beings in general, then why do you continue to use cars to get around? Go back to using horses, or better yet, use your feet to get wherever you need to go, and if you want to travel to another continent, don't use a plane, swim across the ocean. Do you see how stupid that reasoning is? So, a message to all the Anglo-Saxons that are watching me. Don't sacrifice your creativity and open-mindedness to technological innovation and automation you've demonstrated in your culture for many decades. Continue to be the innovators I know you are, and I know this because literally the last century has been solely technologically influenced by you, so don't stop being like this. Don't become arrogant, narrow-minded snobs who look down on those who want to innovate and adopt new technologies. Because besides, as you all say these days, so do that. Don't be French. That's good. The next question is from the user Owendoylegaming7524, asking me the following thing. How would I do a video about Alexander the Great living past the age of 32? Interesting question. After all, Alexander the Great was an exceptional man from every angle. I think, without taking any risks, that he was, proportionally speaking, the most influential man in history in proportion to the short life and reign he had. And imagining what would have become of him and his legacy, which is already enormous in our timeline, if he had lived longer, is quite fascinating. I'm not going to develop the idea that much because, spoiler here, I already have plans to do that alternate story in the near future. But to sum up the idea I would have in mind, it would be consolidation. Of course, Alexander the Great would continue conquering new lands. It was an obsession for him that would never be satisfied fully, but it would be on a smaller scale and more progressively than during his youth with the Persian Empire. The priority would be primarily the consolidation of his power, and laying a solid foundation for a unified Greco-Persian government, attempting to merge both cultures and peoples, just as he wished to do in our timeline. And because men are fertile until almost the end of their lives, Alexander could eventually father a capable and competent heir who could be the first successor to a well-established and long-lasting empire of Alexander the Great. And if that dynamic continues over the next few centuries, it would be very interesting to see the relationship of friendship, rivalry, or enmity that Alexander the Great's empire would have with the Roman Republic, and its eventual conversion to the Roman Empire. In any case, I won't say any more for now. You'll hear more about my perspective on that alternate story when I share it on the channel, so as you all know, subscribe and click on the bell icon to receive the notifications of upcoming videos. The next question comes from the user NewbornViking9721, asking me the following thing: what if Japan had discovered the Americas? Now, this is clearly outside of my expertise, and I don't plan on making a video about that alternate scenario, so I'll try to be as clear and concise as possible with this answer, but I apologize in advance if I make mistakes or if my analysis doesn't seem realistic or clear to you. First of all, you didn't specify in your question when Japan discovered the Americas, so I'll choose the period. I would say that a likely time for such an accidental discovery would be during the time when the Mongol Empire was trying to invade Japan, and although they were unsuccessful, Japan would be for a time under constant naval threat from the Mongols and completely blockaded and cut off from trade with the rest of the world. This situation would force them to find alternative trade routes, especially with the still very mysterious and little-known Europeans. They would eventually launch several expeditions eastward to reach European lands, with many of those expeditions ending in failure, with the explorers dying horribly in the middle of the gigantic Pacific Ocean. But some discoveries, like the Hawaiian Islands, would give them hope to continue trying to reach those distant lands. But little did they know that Europe was still far beyond their reach, discovering instead what would become, in our time, the west coast of the United States. From there, the Japanese would move further down the coast until they came into contact with the more developed peoples of Central America, such as the Aztecs, for example. Eventually, they would establish trade relations with the indigenous population, creating small coastal colonies that would serve as trade routes between the Americas and Japan. But all these trade route projects would not last long because, to begin with, the distance the Japanese had to travel to reach the Americas was gigantic, much more so than for the Europeans, making that project much less profitable for the Japanese. But it would also be the progressive but brutal spread of diseases brought by Japanese explorers, which would gradually hinder trade with the Native Americans, who were less numerous and more aggressive against the Japanese, seeing them as the reason for the terrible diseases they were experiencing, until the situation would become so hostile that the Japanese would have no choice but to leave and abandon that costly project of trade routes with the Native Americans, remaining forever as a small and insignificant parenthesis in their history. But when 2 centuries later the Europeans would arrive in the Americas and would begin to try to colonize them, they would have a much more difficult time than in our reality to do it. Because after 2 centuries of constant disease and excess mortality, the Native Americans would have finally developed the necessary immunity to all the diseases brought by the Japanese, making the Europeans no longer have the numerical advantage they had in our timeline to colonize those lands. And in addition to an indigenous population far superior to our reality, we would also have to add the use and domestication of horses brought by the Japanese 2 centuries earlier, which, if used well, could be a determining factor in considerably slowing down the colonization of the Americas, although not stopping it completely. The Europeans were still a civilization too organized and technologically advanced to be overthrown, much less a civilization that would abandon its attempts to colonize the Americas so easily. So, although I think colonization would be a more tedious and lengthy process for Europeans to achieve, eventually everything would happen similar to our reality. Of course, the biggest difference I could see in the future of this alternate story would be that the indigenous population of the Americas would still be extremely high and present in all the nations of the continent, and in some places would even still constitute the majority of the population of those lands. I hope you like the short alternate scenario I made, Newborn Viking 9721. The next question comes from our buddy Historical Side Quests, which is a very talented content creator about alternate scenarios just like me, but better. So go and watch his work if you don't know him, because it's really good. And his question towards me is, besides Rome, what would be my top 5 empires? And to that, I'm going to say that it's a very difficult question to answer. I know I'm going to sound like a broken record, but as I said before, no empire or nation is worthy of the Roman legacy, or of claiming legitimacy from it. So, the real honest answer would be that I don't have any top favorite empires, because the Roman Empire is the only empire I need in my life, but since I'm not a cunt, I'm going to give you the best possible top I can give anyway. So top 5 would be the Portuguese Empire, top 4 would be the Russian Empire, top 3 would be the OG Achaemenid Persian Empire, top 2 would be the Spanish Empire, and top 1 would be the British Empire. And be thankful I'm not a jerk, because I could have put the Byzantine Empire at the top to shorten the list of empires I've named merely out of courtesy rather than legitimate appreciation on my part. But yes, I would say that rather than this being my top best empires, would be my top less worse empires besides Rome, because like I said, Rome is the only empire that matters. There is a reason why these days, every time somebody say the word empire, besides when we talk about fictional empires like in Star Wars, the first and only empire we all think of is the Roman Empire in our minds, not the British Empire, not the Spanish Empire, and my god, definitely not the French Empire. And that, even if those empires are more recent in our collective memory than Rome by far, just shows once again how none of them can be compared to Rome's legacy. I still hope you enjoyed my top and answer to your question historical side quests, and I wish you luck with your next projects and videos, which I'm really looking forward to seeing. Oh, and by the way, I'm also still waiting for that tutorial on how to make animated maps like yours. So, don't forget. The next question comes from the user Kamenyarov1509, asking me if I think modern Macedonians are real. Well, Kamenyarov1509, not only do I think modern Macedonians are real, but I know they are real. Macedonians have been part of the multi-ethnic diversity that makes up the Hellenistic peoples for thousands of years. And to this day, if you want to find the ethnically closest Macedonians to the Macedonians of Alexander the Great's time, you need look no further than the region of modern Greece called Macedonia itself. There is a reason why the Greeks did not take it well at all when the former region part of the former country that was Yugoslavia adopted the name of North Macedonia as its official name as a nation, because it was rightfully so, a cultural and ethnic appropriation that is irrelevant to that nation composed of a completely Slavic population, and mostly culturally, ethnically, and linguistically, I believe, Bulgarian. So yes, modern Macedonians are real, and they live in the region of modern Greece that bears the same name as its population, as has been the case for almost 3,000 years by now. Next question comes from the user Onyx5491, asking me a what if by some magic Caesar and Alexander swapped minds and they wake up in each other's body. Okay, this is a crazy one. Even my sick mind couldn't have imagined an alternate scenario as crazy and funny as that one. For starters, I don't think that story has the potential to be covered in a full video solely dedicated to that alternate scenario, but I'll still try to give you a satisfactory answer. If Caesar and Alexander the Great had exchanged minds from their respective bodies of their respective eras, one would have ended up very well and the other would have ended up terribly. Caesar, being a highly educated and knowledgeable man about the history known at that time and being a great fan and admirer of Alexander the Great's legacy, seeing him as his absolute inspiration for his own ambitions, would have been perfectly aware of the entire history of Alexander the Great, the situation of the Greeks at that time under the control of the Macedonians, and all the decisive battles that marked the success and legacy of Alexander the Great, as well as all the strategies to adopt in his campaigns to conquer the Persian Empire in the same way that Alexander the Great did. Let's imagine that Caesar, the night before starting his campaign in Gaul, would go to sleep, and the next day he would wake up in the body of Alexander the Great, waking up just on the same day that his father Philip II was assassinated. Caesar would have 2 years to adapt to his new life and crazy body change, and to understand what the hell had happened to him and whether it was all a dream or reality before starting his campaigns against the Persians. In that time, Caesar could combine all his knowledge of history, the life of Alexander the Great, and the battles he and his army fought to gain a complete and absolute advantage over the Persians, perhaps even conquering them more quickly than Alexander the Great did in our reality. But Caesar would also implement several governmental and military reforms that the Romans adopted in the last 3 centuries, in addition to adopting new innovations and technologies that the Romans democratized at that time, being a total cultural and military revolution for the Greeks. He would also know very specific things, such as the importance of completely annihilating the Parthian population that would one day take control of the Persian government, and which would be a terrible headache for the Romans for centuries. And eventually he could redirect the resources of his gigantic empire to march west and conquer what would eventually be the mighty Rome and Carthage, legitimizing his reign as a being capable of seeing the future by leveraging his knowledge of the future and the level of fluency with which he spoke Latin, which would impress any Roman due of not knowing that Caesar was not just an ambitious Macedonian king, but a Latin descendant from the future. So, I think Caesar in the body of Alexander the Great would have thrived in that era, being even more successful than Alexander the Great ever was, thanks to all his knowledge of the future, which would have allowed him to have an unparalleled level of preparation and strategy, and he would surely live much longer than Alexander the Great, being much less of a party degenerate than the Greeks and Macedonians were, laying the foundations for an alternative future where the Greeks would have created a gigantic empire which would have been secretly culturally conquered and dominated by the Romans thanks to Caesar's influence and legacy in the body of Alexander the Great. Meanwhile, Alexander the Great in the body of Julius Caesar would be an unprecedented comic tragedy. Assuming he wakes up in Julius Caesar's body at the same time Julius Caesar woke up in his, that is the day before he started his campaign in Gaul, that would be an absurd and comical disaster for him. To begin with, Alexander the Great, unlike Julius Caesar, would have no knowledge of the time in which he had awakened, nor what was happening, the context of anything, and who the hell was the person in whose body he now inhabited. Everyone among his men, generals, and companions would be completely confused and worried about the mental health of that man, who did not know how to speak Latin and only knew how to speak a somewhat old form of coined Greek and the Macedonian language. And in a very short time, many would be curious to know what the hell happened to Julius Caesar to make him go completely crazy, especially in the Roman Senate with Pompey and Crassus being completely confused that this previously arrogant and ambitious but rational man had now completely lost his mind, forgotten how to speak Latin, and was claiming to be Alexander the Great himself in the body of a man he didn't know. Needless to say that absolutely no one would believe Alexander the Great's words, and everyone would be convinced that Julius Caesar had simply lost his mind, and that his thirst for power and ambitions had driven him completely mad. And from there, either Pompey and Crassus leave that madman alive and simply banish him to a life of complete isolation, or at worst, to completely wash their hands of the problem that Julius Caesar could potentially represent, they would kill him, thus ending the tragic but comical short story of Alexander the Great in the body of Julius Caesar. And the last question comes from the user OberonFanfic777, asking me the following question: do I think Latin or Greek poets were better? And indeed, yes, in my opinion, and it's an opinion supported by most of the ancient Romans, the Greeks were better poets, writers, and storytellers than the Romans by far. The literary and mythological legacy of the Greeks was already unmatched in antiquity, with all cultures around the Mediterranean copying or drawing serious inspiration from Hellenistic culture for their own myths, stories, and poems. But paradoxically, just as they admired and recognized the artistic beauty of Greek literature, the Romans were also highly concerned about the influence it would have on Roman society, considering the Greeks to be much weaker mentally and much more effeminate in their ways of life, something that, for example, Cato the Elder constantly tried to warn Roman society and youth about the danger that Greek influence could have on the martial vigor and masculinity of the Romans. So yes, the Greeks were better poets and writers than the Romans, but at the same time and paradoxically, although the Romans openly admitted that fact, they also feared it because of the cultural influence it could have on their society. And with that, I've finally answered all the questions you asked. Thank you all so much for participating in this special video for my more than 1,025 subscribers. Although, as I write these words, it's a bit ridiculous to still call it that, given that I already have more than 1,500 subscribers. But hey, that's really just another reason to deeply thank you all for the support and appreciation you have for my work, and don't have the slightest doubt that this is just the beginning of a great Roman adventure. And with that, I think this is a good moment to end this video. I hope you enjoyed this special video for the over 1,025 subscribers. Don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and comment on what you thought of it. And without anything else to say, see you next time.